Hey everybody, I'm Katallina, and today we're here to talk about episodes 1 and 2 of TsumaSho. I first heard about this show a few months ago when it was embroiled in massive online controversy about its literal translation for its name into English. There's a very good reason that Crunchyroll is not using it, because translating this directly into English, it comes out as something along the lines of, if my wife became an elementary school student. So yeah, there are definitely a lot of reactions that people had when they saw something akin to that as the title for this. There was a lot of presumption that this was going to be some kind of Lolita-esque abuse of a small child by an older man. And I can understand why people are like, oh god, that's gross, because that would be absolutely gross. Personally, I don't think that that should be something that makes something bannable. I think you can tell a story about anything you choose, but people also choose whether or not they want to engage with something. And when it doesn't end up being properly advertised for some reason, and a title is a part of advertising, then it's not surprising when it ends up missing its intended audience. Now, I've actually had the good fortune to see the first 2 episodes of TsumaSho, which is what we're going to be referring to it as here on the channel, since that is how Crunchyroll is actually advertising it. And I can tell you that, at least in my opinion, they are absolutely stellar and definitely worth your time to check out. I really enjoyed them. I think there is going to be a really fantastic story here. I definitely think there are going to be some aspects that will potentially make some viewers uncomfortable, but sometimes fiction needs to make us uncomfortable. And when I say that, and when I talk about that and everything, I want to make sure that I make it clear that these are minor aspects of the story, that there is nothing akin to what people feared was going to be here, and that the story is actually very conscious of the reality that there were going to be people who would misunderstand its intent, and it does a fantastic job of addressing it, and not only of merely addressing it, but actually utilizing it as an aspect of the overall story, plot, and progression, and using it for both insight into what the story is, as well as a valve for humor in what can be an incredibly heart-crushing and incredibly emotional story. So I think that's really cool. Anyway, let's start with talking about episode 1, which is primarily there to show us what was lost. They do this really wonderful montage type thing at the beginning where it shows us the 2 people who were married. I think their names are like Take and Keisuke or something like that. And it shows what their life was like, and it shows the birth of their daughter and everything. It's not quite the opening from Up, but it's that kind of deal where it shows you just how much these people had to lose. And even though it's a very short and very brief opening thing, they do a really beautiful job. And I was just all like, oh, it's so fluffy, it's so warm. And I'm thinking, whoa, don't get that attached. You know where this is going. But I still found myself really invested in them, and I found myself thinking how wonderful their connection seemed to be. So of course, as they slowly started to intersplice this imagery of the male character, Keisuke, actually like sitting on a bench, and he's all in gray and he's fading out, like, it's an amazing way they transition from this beautiful warmth to the grief and sorrow and everything of what is impacting him in his current life. And I think they did a really great job using both the art design and direction, as well as emotional expression. The reaction of he and his daughter Mai when they realize that the mother or wife has been in this accident, and just how it has actually gone on to touch their lives. And then of course we move the 10 years forward, and we see the little girl walk past their house, and we see the reality of the memories just flood her. It's like, whoop! And the crazy thing is, and I wonder how this is meant to be seen, because as I watched the 2 episodes, this is one of the things I'm very curious about going forward. Did she always behave as though she was this like 35, 40-year-old woman? Or did these new emotions and this conscience kind of like take her over and alter her personality? I may have missed something in the text or in some form of the overall like execution of the story that is supposed to make that more clear. I wonder which of these things it is, because like, as interesting as it is seeing her help these people and everything, I wonder if the aspect of her that is a child is being really heavily damaged by that. And we get much more into that in the 2nd episode. I'm kind of bouncing around here, but when I very first saw that moment, that was my first thought about it. But then we see her walk into their home and everything, and we see her talking to them, and we see the way that she's able to like remember all these details and everything, and that they accept that this situation has happened. They don't worry about, is this normal? Does this happen all the time? How can we prove this? They just roll with it, which is good because it lets us get onto the story and proper. And I really like how they actually deal with the overall interaction between these people, and how they show the ways that having this person reconnect into their lives immediately impacts both Keisuke and Mai and improves their lives drastically. Again, in the back of my mind, I have the thought of at what cost, because I mean, Take is actually in a different life, and she's glancing behind at this situation that is technically no longer hers to have, and I wonder what consequences there will be. But in the immediate, seeing the warmth and joy and hope and everything that her presence brings to these other 2 characters is really miraculous, and it's something I can only imagine that anyone who has experienced the loss of a loved one would kind of wonder just what way that would affect them and how it would be. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that does come up here and there is that Keisuke has this tendency where he wants to proclaim his love for Take and proclaim that she is his wife and everything. Not the first grader, not in a physical sense, not in a immediately or intentionally creepy sense, but because her personality is so flawlessly like conveyed from who she was and who we saw at the start of the episode to how she is now, even though she is this little girl. And it is strange to see that it ends up being her job to correct him on this kind of thinking, and her job to think like the adult when he is basically reverting in his own way to a state of childhood by not thinking about the bigger picture. Like, he buys her a smartphone, and then he wants a picture of her on his smartphone. He wants to show it to his co-workers, and she is like, what in the hell are you doing? People are gonna think you're a frickin' pedophile. And he ends up having to like delete the picture and stuff. And like, it's not that he views the little girl in a directly erotic sense, but rather that he still sees his wife there instead. And he doesn't seem to be able to fully grasp like the reality that while this person might have the emotional spirit of her, that he has to recognize the reality that's standing in front of him, that this is not normal and that this cannot be, and that while he's got this opportunity to speak to her again and everything, that this does not just get to mean an instant continuation of what he had lost, and that he does still need to go through and actually face the process of grieving her and letting her go. And that is something that I think we're going to see as the story progresses, and I don't think that's necessarily going to be easy for any of these characters, including Take, because she has these memories now. But that is what is going to ultimately, I would presume, need to happen. Fortunately, this episode isn't without hope, this episode actually introduces a character that Keisuke meets at work and that he ends up starting to have lunches with, and she is a presumably single female character. And something I really like about this tie-in is that one of the things that actually led to Take and Keisuke meeting in the beginning of the story was that Take would make the bento boxes for him. And with this new woman that we see, and something may or may not happen with this eventually, who knows, but I like the fact that they've set this up in the first episode, because it could be used later on as a symbol of growth if they choose to, is that they become what they call bento buddies. And sometimes he's bringing in the lunches that Taike makes for him, and then sometimes he's ending up having the lunches that this girl makes. And hopefully, ideally, we will eventually see him be able to start focusing on something that can actually be real. I mean, it's a challenging thing when somebody loses a spouse, especially somebody who's still relatively young and who, for all intents and purposes, still has a great big chunk of life ahead of them. I mean, it's really hard to balance between the grief of loss towards someone you loved and the reality that their life ending does not mean your life ended too, and knowing when it's okay to actually be able to pick up the pieces and to give yourself permission to move forward. And I mean, on one hand, while the presence of Take is going to be lovely for them, in that he gets to talk to her and everything, on the other hand, it could be incredibly damaging to him, because it's going to make him want to cling on to what was instead of actually being able to properly see what could be. But those were my thoughts on episode 1, and now that we've dealt with that, let's take a look at episode 2. What makes episode 2 stand out as opposed to episode 1 is that while episode 1 to me was more so about examining Keisuke and Mai's emotional state and having Take come in as this seemingly indomitable spirit who is going to set the record straight, who is going to get Mai up off her ass and get her to go to work, who is trying to get Keisuke to just stop weeping and being sad and everything, and who is concerned about stuff like whether they have proper meals. In episode 2, we get a much better examination of what Take in her new current life as I believe like a 3rd grader is experiencing, and she's going through some shit. I mean, she cannot just be dealing with these two grieving adults' problems, because the reality that she has been reborn into is not without its own flaws and issues. We learn that her parents in this new life ended up being divorced as of last year. She now lives with her mother. Her mother has trust issues, her mother has anger issues, and her mother has like manipulation and abuse issues that she takes out on Take. I wish we knew what her name was as a little girl, because I think it would be much easier to have this conversation if I had 2 names for her, but we don't, so we're gonna have to roll with this. But like, we see that she has her own kettle of fish she's trying to fry while she's trying to save these 2 clueless adults. And that's not entirely fair. It's really interesting to see that, in a way, the passive-aggressive mistreatment that Keisuke has put toward Mai, not out of a sense of malice, but out of a sense of incompetence in his case, is something that could be mirrored in the way that Take's mother in her new life mistreats her, although in that circumstance there is a lot more anger and a lot more aggression and a lot more frustration rather than grief. But I mean, I don't think any of them have seen the fact that the 2 women actually share a parallel despite being of differing generations. And I think that's an interesting insight that really stood out to me. I also found it really interesting that although in the first episode, Take is shown as being this incredibly capable, incredibly has-it-together woman, that regardless of whether she is the 35 to 40-year-old like wife of Keisuke, or whether she is being viewed as the 10-year-old little girl, what we are seeing is that as she spends more time with this family, even though she recognizes that it's doing her harm in that it's like causing rifts between her and the people in her new life, that she can't seem to give it up. Initially she has plans to and everything, and then she breaks down and she ultimately isn't able to go through with it. So it's going to be very interesting going forward to see just how this little girl is going to juggle these differing aspects of her life. Because I mean, to me, when I saw this, what it made me think of was something like Mrs. Doubtfire, where the character has these different personas or hats that they are putting on at different times, and it's not something that's going to be sustainable. It wasn't sustainable for Robin Williams' character in that movie, and if a full-grown adult can't sustain it, even if somebody has the soul of a much older character, how the hell is a 10-year-old supposed to be able to make that function? I think that's going to make for some very interesting storytelling. Anyway, those are my takes overall on the first 2 episodes. I am thoroughly impressed with what they have here. There are so many questions, so many theories, so many different elements to consider, both from a storytelling perspective as well as from an emotional perspective for anyone who has ever lost someone. If you haven't watched this, I would strongly recommend giving it a shot to see whether or not it's for you, because it seems like it's being very beautifully done and that it's being handled with extreme care and extreme compassion. Anyway, I'd love to know whether you guys watched this and what you're thinking, so drop a comment below and let me know, and I'll talk to you in the next video. See you later. Bye!